And live from the internet, it's ZN Live. And today I am very excited to be on episode 398. I'm Phil Weiss. Joining me today is Evie, an account manager at ZN, who runs a number of different and exciting projects. And today, our very special guest is David Henning. And David is an EU influencer with over 80,000 followers on X Twitter. He's also a trade policy expert. He's had extensive experience in government, in shaping the conversation around policy, around Brexit, and a range of different topics. Now, what I want to start with, David, is the question of the channels, because this has really been a very, very important discussion that we've had addressed during our EU influencer event. And the big question is, for people like you who've been very successful on X, Twitter, what do you see, what is your strategy going forward, given the challenges with the platform and your current kind of base there?
Indeed, X was a real part of the trade policy conversation. It was a real part of the Brexit conversation. You actually had at times negotiators having a conversation on Twitter a few years ago being played out in the open. What I've seen in the last 6 months in particular is a real flight from Twitter. You get far fewer conversations. There's a lot of influential accounts have gone from there. What's my approach to that is really diversification. For the last year or two, I've been trying to do more on LinkedIn. It's a different platform. Instead of doing something more regularly, so for example on Twitter you might be wanting to do something several times a day. On LinkedIn, once or twice a week, an update of what you've been up to. I've been exploring Twitter alternatives. Blue Sky seems to be the best one so far. Haven't used Threads because of legacy Instagram issues that I have. But at the moment, it looks like Blue Sky. But what I will honestly say is that between those three channels that I'm mainly focusing on, you get less engagement than you got from Twitter 1 year ago, in my opinion.
Yeah, no, very, very interesting. And I think, we've had a lot of discussions on this topic. It's quite difficult to know because I think we're at a transition moment. So there are still issues that get a lot of traction on X Twitter. There are also... we're seeing quite a good engagement on LinkedIn from a different audience and a different kind of tonality of conversation. But I want to ask you something about X in particular and how it plays a role. You just mentioned that some of the negotiation was taking place on the platform. Now, today, people say that there's been a kind of marked shift to the right, which follows perhaps Elon Musk's focus on a very political kind of positioning, and where he's very deliberately using the platform to pursue a political agenda. Have you seen a change there? You said less engagement, but do you think it's increasing polarization and increasing a certain kind of discussion?
From my side, I haven't seen that move to the right among those that I follow and interact with. What I've seen instead is that a number of the figures, both in the UK government, both officials and politicians, but also around the EU as well, some of the prominent MEPs, I'm seeing less of them. They're engaging less, as far as I can see, when they are there. We're just not seeing the conversations take off. So what it seems is that the people who are left on X, you've got a lot of the same people engaging in the same ways all the time, which is frustrating. You've just not got the diversity of opinion that meant you got really interesting conversations going on there, and meant in a way that policy positions were being tested. This was the thing. You might post something about the way the EU was conducting a negotiation on trade, and you might get back a response from Bernd Lange, for example, the chair of the International Trade Committee in the European Parliament. You might get a comment from one or two of the lead commission officials on the subject. You might get a comment or two from member states. There's still some of that, but there's a lot less of it. And thus far, that hasn't been replaced really. So I think you're right. I think we're still looking for a replacement. I think what we've learned is that there is a market. People want to have that conversation in the open. They want to find the channels, but you've got to all be in the same place, if you like, and that's just not just physically in the same place on the same system. You've got to be in the same place that you want to engage. And right now, a lot of people don't want to engage in a platform run by Elon Musk.
Yeah, I think there's a very kind of a big issue on the intention of the platform, where it's heading. Another topic that we discussed actually at the event was emerging channels. So we had several journalists who are TikTok journalists. So that's kind of almost a new word, a new format, who are dealing with specific topics. We also had people using Instagram to talk about climate change, to talk about a certain kind of issues. Are you looking into those channels to see if there's a political conversation that you might be interested in joining?
Certainly. I mean, I'll add one as well. I mean, I think Substack deserves to be considered a channel now. You see a lot of folk doing their own newsletters. I should mention that what we've started doing in eSight, the organization I work with, the European Centre for International Political Economy, is what we call personalized newsletters, which go out to our subscriber base. We get a pretty good engagement from them, although it's kind of under the radar rather than mostly in public. But we do post those on LinkedIn as well. I've thought a little bit about TikTok. I can't see at the moment how I make that work in the, my explanations are probably going to be a little bit long for that. And as I say, at the moment, I've been using Instagram in a different way. So I don't plan on changing the way I use Instagram. So I'm going to, at the moment, I'm spending a little more time than I spent on Twitter, Blue Sky and LinkedIn together, and getting less engagement. I don't feel that I want to have more and more channels to reach fewer people. I think what I want to do instead is to experiment with each of those channels, think about different ways to use them. So perhaps make more video clips. I've been thinking about that. Newsletters definitely on my mind as to how that could be used. I've got to bear in mind that my typical audience, they want explanations of a certain length. That's going to be a little bit longer than a TikTok minute. So it could be, say, 5 minutes, or it could be a newsletter, an article of 800, 1,000 words. So that's what I'm working with and trying to find the right channels there.
Yeah, I think, and this is going to be a question for us to look at. I think that there is going to be a kind of pretty serious conversation emerging from Instagram and TikTok as younger people who are now the ones that we kind of spoke to at the conference as well, who are using this and dealing with pretty complex issues and kind of trying to give answers, then giving links. But I also think your comment about newsletters is very interesting, because that's a very, very significant trend, which is kind of like the back to the future trend where, emails were boring and now newsletters are all the rage. But obviously, it has to be good quality. And so I think we're back to the good content that has to be well written, well edited, and then then people read it. And indeed, Substack is one of the tools that people are using to do this. So we have a bit of a return to high quality content, which I think is very interesting. Now, we're in this election season. We've just had UK, EU elections, which are pretty significant. And of course, we are approaching the US election. With your experience, obviously you've been observing election cycles for quite some time. Would you say that the current political conversations have gotten much more polarized? There's a lot of kind of theory about how social media has made people more extreme, more polarized. Do you think this is true? I feel that it looks true in the US, but do you think it's true in Europe and in the UK as well?
Yes, that's interesting. I mean, I look at trade policy, and a lot of people think I'm only looking at trade, but we've got to look at the policy part of that, and that involves a pretty close look at politics as well, at elections. What we've seen in the US since 2016 is that trade policy has become an issue in elections. And I wouldn't say in the US, funnily enough, it's not polarized people, but it's, if you like, it's taken them to a quite extreme position. So now you've gone, in the space of really 3 or 4 elections, you've gone from, in the US, to thinking pretty much all trade is bad, and how can we reduce trade as much as possible almost. And that is in common with both candidates. So that's not polarization going on there, but there is a trend there worth looking at. In Europe, it seems to have been different. I think it was a little bit tricky to get a handle on the EU elections as to what was really going on there. There are a lot of different elections, a lot of different themes. Clearly, there is this rise of national populists. You've had that in the UK, you've had that in the EU, but it was a little hard to get a grip on whether there was any kind of strategic direction, or whether polarization might be the right word, or perhaps I'll offer a different word. Is fragmentation a better word for what we're seeing in European elections and political discourse, which is to say that we're all retreating into our subsets, whether that's the policy-led heavy discussion that some people go through, the populist version that others are going through. You see immigration coming up a lot. So maybe that's why it's becoming difficult to get a handle on the elections in Europe. In America, it's clearly, from the distance we're at, it clearly looks like Trump against, really, Harris as it happens.
I want to hear also your thoughts on, I mean, okay, I think, it's like this period that we're going through right now is going to potentially, it's like give up a lot of, it's like not necessarily inspiration, but a lot of need for adaptation as we move along, and especially after November. But I would like to ask you, I mean, from a past experience, it's like fronts, what lessons can countries in generally get from the UK's experience in renegotiating its trade relationships post-Brexit? Because I think, it's like you can have valid and valuable information to share.
I think it's very important that governments communicate well. And I don't think the UK government did communicate well during that whole process. So negotiation between countries is no longer something that goes on in little back rooms. It's going on in public. It's going on our social media, through all the different channels. You've got to manage that process. You've got to understand that it's not just your negotiating teams who are part of the process. I'm part of the process. A lot of the people listening are part of the process. You are shaping a story gradually through a large number of players. That's not easy, by the way, for a government. It was much easier when they were doing it in a small room, our team and your team, but you're not doing that anymore. You're shaping this story together, and you need to work extensively with all your different stakeholders, with all your the various players that can be considered on your team, whether that's businesses, your civil society groups, your journalists, your bloggers. They all form part of that system that we're talking about. I think politicians are finding that pretty difficult. They're used to the idea of command and control. Negotiations work how we want it to work, or how the other side wants it to work. They're not used to the fact that it's going on the sidelines in a way they don't, they're not running how that negotiation goes. They need to find the ways to run that. But that was the lesson I took, and I think that lesson is still valid now. And I think as we look towards a little bit of a reset between the UK and the EU, both sides need to be thinking, how do we shape this? Or indeed, how is this going to be shaped by others who are not us?
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting observation, because indeed, we had a technocratic, especially in Brussels with the EU, form of government, which was negotiations between specialists, and a lot of it behind closed doors. Now, are you saying that we're shifting towards perhaps something that looks more like a political campaign? During an election campaign, everybody knows they have to communicate because they have to reach voters. Now, would you say that there has to be a kind of campaigning or kind of active communication component that needs to be built in to these trade negotiations going forward? Like, having a comms team saying, here's the message strategy, here are your target audiences, and literally running that as part of the process. Do you see that becoming a new structure?
Well, I mean, I think I'm not sure it's even that new. I think we have seen that. I mean, I came into trade in a big way during the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership negotiations between the US and the EU. And there was a real need to make that a communications campaign. There was such a campaign against that across Europe. So it forced, if you like, the EU, then to say we need a campaign in response. Now, that was reactive. What I think has happened since is that quite a lot of folk in the commission have realized now you've got to be proactive. Okay, we learned the lesson. We don't wait to be set upon. Give an example: secrecy. Negotiations used to keep secret all the documents. Then we discovered that the secrecy was the issue, not what was in the documents. If you made the documents public, most people wouldn't read them. And by making them public, you've deprived opponents of one of the key tools they were using by saying everything is secret. There must be something wrong going on. So that's an example of how things have changed. Is now you've got to think, right, most of this needs to take place in public in order to have that communication campaign and to deprive those who would be on the who would not want it to go ahead of the easiest target they have.
Yeah, no, it's a very good point. I remember because we were also involved in some of the discussions on the communication side of these agreements, and there was a big frustration from the political world saying, hey, we're trying to do something that will benefit the business world, and we're getting zero communication and engagement from those stakeholders. So they're not saying anything. So we're kind of alone trying to push this. And I think what you're saying is that there's a need for that communication, but I think it needs to be also framed like a real communication campaign where you say, I have an objective. I need to make, I need to spin this or to position this, this has to be positive because here are the benefits and here are the threats that we perceive. How are we going to neutralize those threats? So it's really like thinking in a campaigning style.
But businesses, one thing we've learned as well is businesses are not just going to come in behind you because it's something that might be good for them. Businesses have to consider, yes, this might be good for us in the long term, but we have customers who are on all sides of this debate. And I think it's quite interesting, the relationship now between governments and businesses as well. And we see this, for example, on a lot of the in a lot of the areas where populists focus and saying, oh, why are businesses focusing on all of these issues? Because their customers expect them to focus on those issues. So businesses aren't necessarily going to be falling in behind governments and saying, yes, we'll do what you want. That's a negotiation as well that is ongoing. It's just a much more complex world than the one we were probably used to 10 years ago. And I'm not sure how many politicians have really implicitly understood this. Plenty have, but I think an awful lot still need to be thinking a lot more about it.
Totally agree with you. And I think I had a comment actually based on the discussion that we're having now and what you said before regarding, it's like your own approach to diversification. I think that, it's like successful examples that we see, it's like from political discourse online have to also do with the fact that there are more social media platforms amplified and also targeting, it's like different and separate fragmented audiences. For example, we've seen, I don't know if you have seen it, if you have a TikTok, but Phil mentioned TikTok, so I need to jump in as, a millennial exploring the platform at this point. But I truly think that Kamala's HQ TikTok account is really a masterclass on how to speak to younger audiences about political discourse, and particularly Gen Z, in a platform where they spent, like most of the time on the content feels authentic, is blending in humor. They're jumping on trends and memes without coming out as forced, while still passing on the political, message. So I think, trying to understand the different demographics according to the platform that you're communicating on is, often a skeptical, thing in traditional politics. But I think it needs to really be integrated so that, we understand which platform we're choosing and for what reason we're doing that.
What I would say to that is it's a time-consuming business. So for me personally, I can only really manage probably 3 platforms. I've made my choice for the moment. If I was, say, to look at going into TikTok, I'm going to have to drop some of the work I do on others. Now, businesses may have slightly more resource. Clearly, Kamala's HQ has huge resources, so they can put into different platforms and segment. Some businesses can do that, but most of us can't do that. So, there is an element here as well to, if you're an influencer or a small business or a small organization, don't beat yourself up because you're not on every channel. I don't think you have time to create that kind of quality content that speaks authentically to your target audience on each platform. You could do so. So I would say, well, I would say this, pick 2 or 3 channels where you feel comfortable and you can put out your message. All right, I may not be reaching everybody I want to reach, but at least if I'm reaching a fair number of folk, that's good enough. I just don't have the time for more. Be realistic.
Of course. And it has to also do with the prioritization of your audience as well, in the sense that you know who you want to target and you know in which channels you're going to be finding them.
Yeah. And I think, you know, well, I completely agree with you. You need to pick a couple of channels. The thing is, you have to remain channel agnostic because things that keep moving. And I wouldn't be surprised if in 1 or 2 years we see a kind of emerging focus around Instagram and TikTok, because it's surprising when you hear some of the very high quality content that is emerging from there. And again, we've seen that with every emerging channel. But in this context of, you know, constant change, when you meet somebody who says, you know, I want to enter into this area professionally, you know, somebody who just finished their studies, what is your kind of words of advice to them?
I've had a few of these recently, actually. And right now I'm saying, look, there's no excuse for not communicating. There's so many channels. If you are interested in being a communicator, start communicating. You won't get it all right, obviously. And you may write a number of things and link them when you're talking to somebody like me. I see CVs and I'll follow your links. One of them might just sort of capture my interest in some way and takes off. And I think don't worry the fact that, you know, some things that you write will probably only be read by 3 people. Some things I write are only read by 3 people as well. It's a matter of getting out there. And it's not just writing. I mean, any channel at all. Just get out there and put some communications down on the subject where you have something to say. You need to have something to say on in whatever your chosen area is. Then find your channels, go for it, and see what you're doing. If you can, one tip on writing, because this is something I'm particularly passionate about, don't write too long. Edit your pieces strictly, or get somebody else to edit them to really cut them down to the main points. I see far too many newsletter, Substack, blog pieces which are just too long. If it's longer than 800 to 1,000 words, it really needs to have good reason for being so.
Yeah, no, I think very good advice. And learning to communicate, I think, is now a core part of most jobs, you know, especially when you're into an area of policy. You need to express what it's about. You need to simplify the story. You need to adapt it. And I think, as you rightly said, it's also about what we call a micro niche. You don't have to have a massive audience. You have to have the right audience for you. And it's indeed can be small groups because they're the ones that matter to your project, or, you know, they're the person who are going to make the key decision. Okay, so now it's time for our recommendations. So, David, I know you have several books to recommend to our audience. So tell us what you think they should be reading.
Well, on trade policy, I can't not recommend the book of my friend Dmitry Grozobinski, Why Politicians Lie About Trade. And what I love about this book is the title really captures it. You're in there. You're thinking, right, this is going to tell me a story about, you know, I know politicians say strange things, so that's right in. I love the title, and the book you'll find on pretty much every trade policy specialist's shelf. I've also got 2 recommendations around the US elections. One is the best book ever written, in my opinion, about a US election, about in many people's opinions. It's called Fear and Loathing on the Campaign Trail 72, Hunter S. Thompson. It's a wonderful wonderful read, and it just tells you about American politics. You can believe you're there, particularly if, like a lot of us, we're actually stuck in Europe. And the other one, which is less well known, but I really like this book. It's called The Political Brain, and that is looking at emotions in political decisions, and it's why people don't just make the decisions that are perhaps best for them or analyze the facts dispassionately. It's talking about how you communicate in politics. And I found that a really interesting book. Again, it's focused on the US. It's more in the time of Bill Clinton as presidency in the early 2000s.
Excellent recommendations. Evie, what are your recommendations for our viewers today?
Passing from politics to art, my recommendation is the Great Art Explained YouTube channel. It's a channel that offers short, insightful deep dives that unravel the mysteries behind famous masterpieces and art movements. It's hosted by James. I think he is a gallerist, like an art connoisseur. And each episode presents well-researched insights and historical context, making complex art concepts easy to understand. And the mission of the channel, in any case, is to make art accessible to everyone. So it's worth checking it out.
Thank you very much. And my recommendation is actually both a book and a series called Pachinko. If you haven't checked it out, it's on Apple TV. It's really good. It's about the the history of Koreans in Japan, the relationship between both countries and communities. It's beautifully shot, but it's also a story with a lot of history. It goes back all the way to before the war, the Second World War, and the dynamics, and it's kind of very well acted and brilliant research. So that is all we have time for today. David, thank you so much for all your input. It was very interesting, some great takeaways, and we will see you online on whatever platform you enjoy this week. See you around. Have a great weekend. Bye-bye. Thank you, David. Very